exceed anything we've experienced so far. So for example, when the GFC happened, the downturn in global trade meant there was a flood of surplus containers, shipping containers, onto the market at ports. And of course people build houses and all sorts of things. Shipping containers are fantastic. So, you know, possibly a lot of housing in the future will actually be shipping containers, at least in and around ports where all these things will end up. Because if global trade shrank to a 10% of what it is, it's mind-boggling the number of these containers there already are. And even though we think, oh yeah, but there's a lot of people in the world, there's a lot of need for resources, most of it's the need of the economy just producing and consuming. And as soon as you stop doing that, we've got so much stuff. From the point of seeing that energy descent was the least thought about future, even less than the idea of catastrophic end of civilization, I thought it was important to try and look at the diverse ways in which energy descent could unfold. Not just differences from place to place, but also in a sort of a global process level. And my future scenarios work was based on a two-way variables of the variable of how fast oil would deplete post-peak, the uncertainties about that ranging from maybe 2% per annum to more catastrophic at 10% per annum. And then the other driver that I thought was the most powerful single driver of the future, which was climate change. And whether that was going to be relatively benign and slow in onset, or whether it was going to be more severe and rapid. And that then created four quadrants, four combinations that I called the scenarios. So I was suggesting that these macro energetic climatic factors, even though they are actually sort of caused by sort of human activity, would end up being things that happen to humanity that it will have to adapt to, both at a collective level and a sort of a community level and right down to an individual level. And so I called the relatively benign onset of climate change and relatively slow decline of oil green tech. And obviously that's, you know, the most sort of least disruptive of the energy descent four scenarios. And then brown tech was a similar slow decline in oil but rapid climate change. And that was characterised by more weather and climate crises, droughts, floods, cyclones, that sort of thing, as well as the same as what's happening in the green tech, a contracting economy. Because my green tech scenario is not what a lot of people talk about of a green tech growth scenario. And then the possibility of a much more severe decline in oil that would actually lead to a quite rapid unravelling of the global economy and leave people much more dependent on just whatever was actually in their bioregion or accessible locally. So that would involve what a lot of people would call some sort of collapse. But that is likely to lead to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions so dramatic that it might save us from severe climate change. And so I call that Earth Steward, because it's a scenario where, having gone through this sort of quite catastrophic collapse, things then settle out into the new scenario where the seasons are still largely working, nature is working, agriculture and food growing are possible, but in a much simpler society, scarred by the huge effects of the collapse of the global industrial economy. But of course, with all of those resources all lying around to reuse. And then the fourth scenario I called lifeboats, and it was where there is that same collapse in the global industrial system, but we end up in the climate cooker anyway. And that is possible via the tipping points that have been postulated by scientists, that there are mechanisms like the release of the tundra methane and the melting of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, and ocean acidification and other processes, that once they get to a certain point, it will no longer be driven by just greenhouse gas emissions from humans. It'll be self-reinforcing too. And mostly, you know, people just talk about that as, oh, well, that's just the end of the world. Whereas I suggest that even in that world, some sort of reorganisation would happen. And I model a lot of that on what happened in the decline of Rome with the monasteries, how small groups of people actually conserved a lot of the knowledge and capacity of civilization who were better set up to do so, but society overall goes through some sort of dark age at least. So, of course, that does assume that the runaway climate change just doesn't keep leapfrogging and actually take us out of energy descent into truly collapse, where maybe there's a few people left living on the edge of the Arctic as hunter-gatherers, as some climate scientists and activists have said is a possibility. But that would push us out of the energy descent future truly into collapse. So all of these things are sort of quite relative, but what I showed from that is that it was possible to have strategies and responses that were adaptive to all four of those scenarios. And a lot of what we're talking about in permaculture and transition initiatives and simplicity concepts are actually useful no matter which of those four scenarios is emerging, because that's actually the point of scenario planning, to try and tell plausible stories and not necessarily pick winners, but have strategies that are useful in all of them. Yeah. Retrofitting the suburbs is accepting that the energy descent process, we are into the early stages of it now, and we don't have time to redesign all of our human settlements into some sort of ecologically eco-villages and eco-cities adapted to a world of energy descent. Because that process, even when you have a growth economy, takes decades, if not centuries. So largely people are going to face the energy descent future with the physical infrastructure and the housing that already exists. And most will probably face that through some sort of economic contraction crises where they're living now. Some may move, and there's a whole history of these sort of energy descent ideas and permaculture being associated with a move to the country, a move to rural areas as a place that's a better place to be more self-reliant. And that still may be true, but for most people there's both a necessity and an advantage in looking at where they live already. And for most Australians, that is some sort of detached housing in what we call suburbia, whether that's in our capital cities or whether it's in similar housing in our regional towns and even villages like the one we live in, that most people are living in those separate houses on small blocks. And what that template of living makes possible is it's possible to incrementally adjust what is happening there and provide a lot of people's needs by growing food, by modifying the house to make it more less dependent on energy, by harvesting some of the water, and by using some of the space that exists in our relatively large houses to start doing more in the household economy, doing things for ourselves rather than depending on money. And that it's easier to do that in a suburban house than it is in an apartment, especially when we talk about modifying the environment or growing food. As we move to higher density residential areas, it requires more of all of the residents and the whole community, and often the policymakers and the lawmakers agreeing that these changes are necessary. Whereas in suburbia, it's possible for people who are motivated and able to initiate some of these changes before society has agreed they're necessary. And that the modifications can also be done to some extent even under the radar of regulations that might inhibit them, and whether that's having chooks in the backyard or making a grey water system that's redirecting the water out to the garden. All of these things are much easier at that scale. And on top of that, because Australia, most Australian cities are relatively mild, benign climates compared with Northern Hemisphere cold climates, the capacity to grow food almost year round and the ability to survive in houses without any heating, if people are reasonably fit and active, means that there's not so much critical dependency on centralised systems. So Australia is both a place where most people live in this pattern and also where there's the greatest opportunities to make those changes. So in the process of doing that, it's not just a forward-thinking adaptation to energy descent, it's also, oh, this is actually a better way to live. So at the moment, a lot of suburbia is a sort of social dead zone because they're dormitory suburbs where people leave and go to work. If people are more working from home, if there's more activity happening at home, then that builds the capacity for community. As well as things like less crime because there's more casual surveillance on the street because people are around more. Now, if we look at this in a conventional sort of urban framework, say, oh, that's more activity happening at home, that's crowding. Now, when people lived in a terrace house with a family of 8, yes, having more activity at home might have increased stress of crowding, but we have the opposite situation mostly where we're suffering from undercrowding at home, that there's empty houses where people are not around, where there's loneliness and lack of social interaction, and a huge dependence on going out every day to work, to social engagement, which gives us a sense that our cities are crowded with people, but half the buildings are empty at any one point. So, and we've got the cities being crowded by people moving between those empty buildings, mostly in cars. But if we actually make better use of the facilities we've already got, that's a way of adapting to a frugality brought on by economic contraction, by less job opportunities, by less wages. And a lot of these adaptive strategies are actually necessary to deal with the first phases of energy descent, which are most likely to express themselves as a contracting economy. So they don't necessarily express themselves by a shortage of food. The governments will ensure there is food in Coles if it's the last thing they do. That and defend the territory. But of course, if people are thinking about this situation and thinking their job is very insecure and wondering about, will the government still be paying for healthcare, and gee, we might have to pay to go to the doctor, or pay to go to Coles to buy fresh food. Well, I can grow some vegetables, I can't manufacture antibiotics. So clearly what people do in any sort of economic contraction that's happened in the past is they do the things they can do and save money for the things they can't do. And so what happens is you get this restarting of household and community non-monetary economies, and all the simple things of maintaining the building, childcare, a degree of home education and entertainment, doing those things yourself rather than doing them by money. So a lot of these things are actually just rebuilding the normal living patterns and capacities that existed in my childhood in the suburbs of Australia in the 50s and 60s. So some of retrofitting the suburbs is radical. Some of it is just re-establishing what people of my generation remember as normal. And that process overall might take an economic contraction, but a large number of people are already doing it partly for thinking about energy descent, but partly because they reckon it's actually a better lifestyle. And the big issue that often underlies this retrofitting is the issue of debt. Because housing is worth so much because of our bubble economy, or costs so much, whether you're buying it or renting it, the money to support that is the biggest problem. And a lot of people pursuing this are saying, got to get out of debt first, and that might involve moving from a high mortgage in a capital city to a much less mortgage, or getting rid of the mortgage by buying a similar house in a country town. Or a more radical approach of, no, we're actually going to buy a house in a much poorer suburb and actually get out of debt. So then we can actually do what we really want to do rather than being forced to work to the maximum to pay for the debt. So debt is sort of one of those big inhibitors in the retrofitting the suburbs process. And a lot of the changes that are needed are actually at that sort of behavioural level. So my work on retrofitting the suburbs sort of started off with the focus on the built and the biological, the sort of permaculture redesign of the backyard, the addition of passive solar greenhouses onto the north side of buildings, all of, the installation of water tanks and grey water systems. But the behavioural domain is at least important, and as we move closer and closer into the energy descent crisis, the behaviour change is the low-hanging fruit in retrofitting suburbia. So in the same way that we're not going to rebuild the cities and ignore all this existing housing stock, when we're actually in a house, say, well, gee, we can get out of debt by taking in two boarders and having someone share the house. That's a big behaviour change, but it is very effective and very achievable and a real thing that people will do. So people who are doing that ahead of the necessity make a better job of it. So that's what my work is trying to encourage and help those on that pathway. Well, firstly, if you've got a couple who are both working full-time, if they sat down and did a serious economic business analysis of this project, of both working full-time and the costs of doing that, both the direct costs of clothes and transport to go to work and the knock-on effects of not having enough time and energy to make your own lunch, let alone sort of fix up the, clean out the gutters on the house, or a million other things that require you constantly to buy those services in an economy where the costs of those are very, very high because wages are very high in Australia, mostly to cover mortgage debt. So this whole cycle of trying to earn more money to pay for the mortgage and all the costs of living, for a lot of people now, if they did a proper analysis, they would say, one of us should go back home and restart the household economy, work out how to live with less, or both of us go part-time, earn less money and put our remaining energy and time into productive activities that reduce our costs of living. And so that's already the case, that people have been conned into the idea that work is actually maximising their economic opportunities. For a lot of people, it already isn't doing that. It's uneconomic activity that they're engaged in. When looked at as a household. So that's the first thing. And of course, a lot of people would actually prefer to do that. A lot of people find in their work it's so bureaucratised, so rigid, there's so little opportunity to make their own decisions. A lot of people are now looking back to what used to be the sort of really boring things of being at home, being a housewife, and saying, no, this is actually autonomy. This is where I get to decide what I'm going to do or what part of the day. The other effect is, of course, the huge opportunities that have come about as a result of information technology to be partly working from home anyway for so many people. And of course, many people thought that once this technology was there would be a massive return to home-based work. It's been very, very slow to actually emerge and take advantage of that. The third thing is the relatively large size of houses and the underutilisation means often people have a home office already set up, but it's not actually sort of really being used. So being able to go to work in the morning in the office and then go out and work in the garden and let the chooks out at lunch. So many synergies that happen from a home-based lifestyle. Now, if you're doing that in a place where there is no one else about, of course, you've got to be a bit of a pioneer. If you're doing it where other people are starting to do that too, then instead of the place around you, other than your own place being a hive of activity, that sort of suburban wasteland, if there's other people doing that too, then it starts to sort of build community and connection. So there's a strong sense of these things work better when people are clustering, even if it's just 2 or 3 people in a street or within walking distance of each other. So, for example, parents at home organising some mutual childcare arrangement with 2 or 3 other families and creating a new normal of not just what happens in that childcare, but the whole way they're living, can shape that with the next generation, because this is almost the most important part. A lot of people are going, what do I actually want for my children? And a lot of people are responding to, oh, the kids in primary school have got iPhones. Is that what I really want for my child? So there's a lot of people from all sorts of reasons saying, no, I don't want to be exposed and exposing my children to more and more things that I see as dysfunctional. And the best way to do that is some degree of withdrawal and rebuilding a new normal. And the easiest place to build a new normal is at home. And then building that with others in the community. So I think there's a lot of those reasons that are actually driving the huge surge in people interested in growing their own food and people actively doing that. So the idea that people would sort of reject these ideas as radical, I think they're at a point where a lot of people would like to do that, but they just can't quite see how to get out of the treadmill and the trap they're in. Yes, well, permaculture's been seen as an apolitical approach to making a better world, and I think that's been really useful, that it hasn't been driven by ideology, or that we even need to agree about energy descent before we can say let's go and plant some trees or make a garden or do any of the other things that are classic permaculture activities. So I think that's been a great strength. But that's also then led to a view amongst political activists, especially on the left and from the environmental point of view, and saying that, well, all that activity is fine, but it's not really addressing the big issues and doesn't sort of really change anything in society. That until you change the policies and at the top, nothing really changes. And it's true that decades of permaculture activism haven't really succeeded in transforming the suburbs, that the examples are small and scattered and modest in their achievements. But we can also make the same critique of social justice and environmental activism over the last 30 years. You can see lots of little achievements and what's been won, but a lot of people will admit that maybe it's actually generally gone backwards, that the problems have got larger, or they've broken out in other forms, or that the bad players have worked around the legislation, etc. So the permaculture approach is, I believe, has a political intelligence behind it, and that it starts from the premise that if we're facing a world of less, it's actually hard to get a mass movement shouting for less. There's not many precedents in history for that. But if people can see that as the system becomes more dysfunctional, they can just quietly start withdrawing and doing other things, and that they'll be better off as a result. Like some of the strategies suggested, then that's an immediate gain for the early adopters. The people who have to sort of try and imagine this and go against the flow of society get the benefit of being the first in. It's like, going to the op shop when there's not much competition because everyone else is out consuming clothes and feeding them into the op shop. You get first choice. When everyone's doing this, obviously the choice will be less. So there's an advantage to early adopters which compensate for the very difficult social drag and obstacles in having to be pioneers. And that's really important if we are moving into a world where we're actually moving into voluntary frugality through some process or other. There's got to be some gains in it to drive the process. Because a lot of movements in the past, social justice, were how dispossessed people can reclaim what they have been taken from them, or gain something new. Whereas here we're having to say, we're having to gain something new that is quite abstraction by giving up some form of materialism that the system is driving towards. That then creates an example which is at a small scale by definition, because it's a household, it's a behavioural thing, it's maybe a rural property, but it's not a change in a whole industry or a government policy. That means another person, another household, another farmer, landowner, small business person can copy that without the permission from the gatekeepers, the banks, the regulators. A lot of what's happening at that scale can just be copied by people. And that's really important because it avoids the blockage where you have, here we have a model, but for it to really work, it's got to be done by some whole industry. So you can just get replication. And what that then does is also create a learning cycle of what I was talking about before, about how the new solutions will be so place and situation specific. A lot of things when copied don't actually really work perfectly. So that you keep getting incremental modification. So more people doing things at that scale in their own lives at the household and community scale provide more examples and small scale mistakes. Because the mistakes are small scale, they don't have too much adverse effect and they don't totally kill off whatever that innovation or idea was, because lots and lots of people are doing it. Once there is a significant number of people are adopting these strategies, and I've suggested between 5 and 20% of the population in affluent countries, or at a global level 5 to 20% of the global middle class, the effect of that would be enormous on the global economy, because it would actually be 5 to 10% contraction. And the global economy is absolutely dependent on constant growth. So that if people go on what's really a consumption strike, not against one manufacturer, one company, but just generally, systemically, and are rebuilding the household economy, I've suggested that people could reduce their participation in that global corporate government-dominated system and rebuild it in the household and community non-monetary sector and in the sort of cash economy and exchange economy by at least 50% without it being too hard to do. So yes, if 20% of people did that, that would be a 10% contraction in the monetary economy. And gee, would the governments and the corporations notice that? Now there's two things then that could come out of that. They could go, right, squash all of that, repress all of that. And we see elements of that now, a bit like the raw milk scandal in Victoria, where small dairies producing these products directly into consumers that happen to be a threat to the mainstream if they grew to any significant scale, are sort of eliminated by regulation or whatever. But the difficulty of authorities doing that is the solutions are so diffuse and difficult to see, and a lot of them are not actually even happening in the monetary economy, and a lot of them are behaviour change, that it's hard to actually regulate them out of existence. The other thing that could happen is authorities could go, what do you people want? And that would create a constituency, the possibility of a political discussion from a position of strength. Whereas a lot of current activism is people are shouting loudly for certain changes, but are totally dependent on the system. Therefore, all they've got is their voices. They don't have anything in their what they are doing that actually adversely affects the system, because they continue to consume, they continue to work, they continue to have their money in the bank contributing to the same system. Whereas if people have withdrawn that, their capital out of the bank, their work out of the system, and their consumption out of the economy, and not eliminated those things completely, but as much as possible brought them down where that system actually can't get those things, then that is a position of some degree of economic autonomy. And that is a position of strength, even if it's only 5 to 10% of the population. Whereas conventional approaches to change, so you've got to get a majority of people on side. But when you look at that and you say, well, in the campaign against Australia's involvement in the Iraq War, I think we got 70% or something of the population were against going to Iraq, but we still went. So conventional politics often doesn't work at the 50% level. It's sometimes to do some radical change that the system really doesn't want to go there, you need 80 or 90% of the population. Whereas people not participating, you may need a much smaller proportion. And if that fails, you've built, at the worst case scenario, you've built little lifeboats, even though they might be leaky ones and not very good ones. But you've built the basis of a parallel economy that may be able to build as the other one breaks down. Now, none of those things are certain, but that strategy is a real political strategy. And, you know, if you wanted to analyse it politically, you might say, oh, that's sort of anarchist. But anarchism is not a sort of very useful term because, you know, for more than 100 years, it's been sort of demonised as the mad bomb-throwing person or a very depressed poet who sort of drinks too much. Some other view of what an anarchist is. But if you just look at that permaculture strategy, you say, oh, well, that's sort of like an anarchist sort of view of the world. But it doesn't, we don't start from that premise. We just start, no, this is a better way to do things, and that may have agency or it may not at a political level. But it's got as good a chance or better chance than the conventional approaches to activism. Well, I think it's important to conserve one's own subculture that reflects that change. If you go out into the world with the ideas and you're going to go out and work, as some American permaculture colleagues say, in the belly of the beast, it's not only very hard, it's inevitable that as you work in that situation, your own values will be compromised and changed by the system more than you will actually change it. It's a bit like a small country trading with a big country is not a good idea. It's an exploitative relationship. It's the same in nature. Think trade and exchange needs to happen between like-scaled entities. So that means it's important to build a household and community networks of like-minded people, if you like, a subculture, which help maintain and reinforce the values. Now, of course, a lot of people look at that and say, oh yeah, that's separating oneself in a ghetto or a separate group from society. And it's, to some extent, all minority ethnic cultures that have survived a domineering culture have done that. That's how they've survived. Now, we're used to that historically being in a geographic network. You get a cluster of people of the same religion or whatever in old cities in the world living close together, creating neighbourhoods. Christopher Alexander actually talked about this in terms of subcultures and lifestyles are appropriate in a particular area, neighbourhoods of like-minded people. But we also exist in that world through networks now, almost more so. And most activists actually exist socially in those networks, and that helps as a bulwark against the place-based, overwhelming, sort of oppressive nature of the inevitability of the system around us in a physical sense. Some people escape the oppression of that by moving to the country, and that is one strategy where the pressure of that system in destroying what you're doing is less. The sweet point in some ways, I think, is actually small towns, and in some ways because they have some of the less of those pressures of the city, but not so many of the disadvantages of being of remote countryside. But it's, I think, very important to be engaged in things that where we are a jack of all trades in our own life. We do actually have some connection to growing food. If we're not doing it ourselves, there's a gardener who sort of partly feeds us. That we do know something about sort of how to fix basic things that we need. But that we recognise we also need to be a master of one. Well, that might be we're an academic researcher, or it might be that we are actually a mechanic, or we are actually an urban market gardener growing food for people. That to be in permaculture a jack of all trades and a master of one, rather than this dichotomy that we're either this jack of all trades and can't really do anything well, or we're the conventional societies, we're just the expert in one thing and we're totally dependent on the system for everything else. So the empowerment comes from being the jack of all trades, but the value to society, and that includes as an activist, is actually being as a master of one, where we say, okay, we're going to focus on this part because we have particular skills, knowledge, capacities, and it's right where we are, or whatever that opportunities to focus. And I think that's a balancing act that is sometimes difficult, because a lot of activists can end up pouring themselves into the task, and their basic daily living situation is not being supported or dealt with. And similarly, it is possible to say, well, I'm just going to completely do this as a private thing and not see a responsibility to contribute in the community or extend what I've learnt. But I think activists are more likely to be drawn constantly into thinking they've got to fix the thing at the big picture, while at home things are falling apart. And household and community, of course, are the ways to give more capacity to that we can't do everything as individuals. I think the emotional resilience is also connected to physical resilience. The being physically active, doing things that are productive, and growing food. Other people, it's being self-propelled, on foot or on a bike. There's so many ways in which the physical engagement with the world that actually builds resilient capacity also translates into an emotional resilience. Simple things that, experiencing bad things in a more less than disastrous way. And whether that's having, like we do, a bushfire plan to stay and defend in all circumstances, means that we have to actually run that plan and do things for it in summer and imagine ourselves into the bushfire. So imagining yourself into a bad situation, you know, so in some ways it's planning for the worst and hoping for the best. Now some people find that as, no, they don't want to go there, they don't have the emotional resilience to even think about that, and it's best just not to think about it. I suppose being able to think about adverse situations is a sign of some sort of strength, that you're being reinforced and supported in other ways, that you can afford to think about those things. So I think that's one aspect. And when we came to develop this property on the edge of Hepburn Springs on 1 hectare of land, I saw all the land around and imagined it maybe being, you know, urban agriculture and permaculture sort of development, but I thought more likely maybe it will be all more infill development, and maybe it'll be high-rise apartments of tourist hotels with tourists taking photos of the little permaculture place. So I told myself these stories, in a sense, like really bad stories, to inoculate myself against being disappointed or upset about things as they happen. And those things haven't happened in those ways, but I think that's part of and I think it's also making a joke of those things, of accepting that the idea of agency, that we can sort of create the future, is itself something that comes out of our cultural history, that in different cultures people didn't necessarily expect that they had this control over the future or everything. So being more accepting of what happens, I think, is part of that emotional resilience, and recognising that good and bad things emerge in any set of circumstances and scenarios. So I don't have a really utopian separation of here's all the good things over here and there's all the bad things there. My energy descent scenarios all involve a mixture of things that some of us, you know, would look at and say, yeah, well, there's some good things and there's some bad things. So in that way, I've looked forward for decades to economic contraction, because I think it's the necessary precursor for a lot of good things to happen that we've been trying to do with permaculture, but it's a bit like wading through deep mud in an affluent society where whether people like it or not, their behaviour addictively goes towards whatever that system delivers, even if they can see, oh no, I don't want to be like that, but they end up being like that anyway. You say, oh yeah, well, it would be different if the economy was contracting. And we see that around the world today. The actual dynamism of permaculture activism in the world is, yes, there is a lot of activism in Australia, but in the United States and in Europe, where the economy's much worse, and in a lot of poor countries, it's actually much more serious and much greater achievements. So I think it's a matter of seeing the silver lining in dark clouds, and accepting also that the enormous privilege of having lived at the peak of global energy, at the same time that that's a time of enormous disconnection where people don't know what is worth believing in or doing, and where, you know, we have one of the highest suicide rates, youth suicide rates in the world, in Australia, in the country that's the richest country. So the possibility that, as people said in the Depression, oh, actually that was a good time of community and social interaction because people supported each other. So without being naive about those things, to recognise that through crisis there is actually productive change. And so recognising that, yes, not all of it is going to happen by sensible, you know, policies where we think about things ahead of time and do things in sensible ways. But yeah, there's still good things can come out of that.